So much, Samantha, and thanks to everyone who could join this afternoon. I'm excited to talk about podcasting. I can do it all day, and it was really hard to condense this information into several slides, but you're welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn or via email or wherever if you have questions and you want to dive in. I very much took the approach of this is you as a podcast host, and can certainly talk about podcasting when you're a guest. But I know you all are amazing and have stories to tell, and so I'm pleased to share information with you just to whet your appetite about podcasting and how it can really be a catalyst for transformation with the work that you do. So I started podcasting, just a little about me. I started podcasting in 2017 with no experience. I was unemployed, left the Obama administration, had no job, but had a lot of time, was upset with what was happening in the world, and was cutting an avocado when I was listening to NPR as well, and heard just people saying things that were just completely inaccurate about the US-Mexico border, about Muslim Americans. And this was around the whole border wall, Muslim ban era of the previous administration. And so I was really frustrated and thought that there's got to be a way to connect the dots between the policy and what people are understanding about policy, right? The reality and what people are hearing all over the place. And so I got really frustrated, and I was like, what in the world is, it was more crass than that, but it was like, what in the world is going on with people? And there, was the title of my podcast. And I dove into learning, got out of my comfort zone and went to podcast conferences, spoke to podcasters, was hitting up people on Twitter, on LinkedIn, cold emailing. And it was just a great way to sort of understand this amazing growing space. And I ended the podcast in the earlier part of this year. By day, I work at Howard University, and I still miss it. I intend on going back, but I needed to pause for a little bit. But I still do opportunities or do things like this to talk about podcasting, because I think most people should have a podcast. All right, I'm just going to take a second to share my screen with you and go through some slides that I prepared, and we're going to have an interactive session as well. Okay, so I'm going to hide. All right, so just high level, what is podcasting? Podcasting is any form of media that is downloadable, subscribable, audience friendly, and it could be either audio or video. And usually you've seen the icons on Apple, you'll see the Spotify icon, you'll see other different podcast platform icons. And one of the, the most common questions I get from new podcasters or even people who listen to podcasts is like, how do you find them? Or maybe if you listen to podcasts, you'll say you can download this to wherever you listen to podcasts. It's simply you go to the website of the organization, or usually an Apple or Spotify. You can search for the podcast, and if you can download it, if you can subscribe, and you can actually hear what's going on, it's essentially a podcast. And as of late, we've seen a lot of podcasts do both audio and video. Video is not required. I personally like audio only because I think I get distracted with the video, and audio allows me to really hone in on what's being said. But that's the gist of what a podcast is. Because I know the audience, I wanted to just share with you just a little bit of the trends and who listens, so that hopefully if you're thinking about podcasting for your own organization or for your office, you have a sense of what is happening in the broader landscape of podcast listening. So right now, as of early this year, Edison Research put out, it's actually earlier this year, not March 2018, Edison put out research that said that there's 162 million podcast listeners, and the trends have gone up, significantly over the last 15 years, when there were 11 million listeners. Most, they're educated. Most are most are white, but that number is growing exponentially, particularly in the Hispanic populations. As no surprise, we know that this is a growing population. And what's really cool for me, I think, is that there are more bilingual podcasts. So that population is able to tap into topics and issues in their native language, in Spanish, which is phenomenal, right? But still, whether it's Asian, Black, other minority groups, these populations are growing exponentially in terms of their listenership. The vast majority are under the age of 55. In particular, the largest listening group is between the ages of, I think, 24 and 54. And so it makes sense. I think, these are the groups that are still in the working space. They're active, they're still learning, they may be in school or a grad program. And so they're eager to listen, right, and to learn about what's happening in the world and to hear different perspectives. They tend to make, so 45% make around $75,000 or more annually. So it's an interesting demographic. And I will say that as individuals who may be interested in speaking to your constituent group, I would bear in mind that, your constituents may not be up on all the podcasts or even be listening to podcasts. So you want to ensure you orient them to how to find your content and maybe why your content is different from, say, a press conference or a town hall, which I'll talk about a little later on. So why should you all consider podcasting? So I'm only going to highlight the two items in blue. But in short, you want to recenter the perspective that is unique and different from the norm, right? A podcast shouldn't be, in my opinion, and from what I hear from many others, a podcast shouldn't be a venting session. You are a conduit for giving a story that the listener may not necessarily hear about in their day to day, or even listening to CNN or any of sort of the mainstream platforms. So your goal as state legislators is to influence, right? And there are lots of different tools and mechanisms to do that. And podcasting is just one. And if you do it correctly, you can really reshape the way that you tell stories and influence others around whatever issue it is that's important to you. Also, about the thing about podcasting that I think you all should consider is that you're on the offense. It's your platform, it's your voice, and you can invite anyone that you would like. You can talk about issues in the way that matters to you. You can bring on perspectives that maybe you wouldn't normally have access to. You can use a podcast as a way to leverage opening up the doors to other conversations. And so you can really use this as a way to take risks on your own, and really sort of open up your aperture around the particular topic that you are discussing, whether it's climate change, whether it's national security issues, whether it's equal pay, right? There's so many different ways to look at something. And I think oftentimes when we're in the political space, we think in terms of maybe perhaps how our party might talk about a particular issue, which is fine. But the podcasting space allows you a little bit more room and flexibility, creative flexibility, to look at something from a different perspective, particularly if you come from like a very diverse community, or you have very diverse constituents. This is a great way to really sort of expand the scope of the conversation and really use your platform and your voice to reshape a narrative. So there is an art and a science of podcasting. And I, again, have learned over the years, it's really easy to just like purchase a mic, plug it into your computer, and just start ranting, which a lot of podcasts do. And again, I think that, there's a difference, kind of like with anything, right? There's a difference between like doing something and doing something well, right? Like we can all get behind a microphone, We can all write a paper or blog post, right? But if you want to do it well, you've got to learn the art and the science, or at least practice, read about the art and the science. I'm a big hip hop fan, and so I have lots of hip hop references if you haven't caught them. But Jay-Z says, we change people through conversation and not through censorship. And I know this conference that you all are participating is about centering the human experience, right? Rethinking how we approach topics. And podcasting is that space where we are now able to essentially democratize the conversation. So it's not just the politicians having a conversation, it's not just the media having the conversation, but ordinary individuals like myself who was pissed off about a particular thing can get on the mic and I can have a conversation with other experts or other politicians or other folks in media, for example. And I personally believe that's the way that we can break through a lot of the divisions that we have in this country. So the art, again, I won't go through everything. I just want to highlight a couple of items for you. I want you all to think about your story. What is your perspective, right? The best, if you are a podcast listener, think about why you like that podcast, right? What about the host or the conversation speaks to you, right? My favorite podcast, or one of the podcasts that shaped the way that I do my work, is On Being by Krista Tippett. Not even in the political space whatsoever. But when I listen to her podcast, she starts her show with a simple question about how the guests came to their religion or came to understand the role of faith or a higher power. That is a deeply profound question. Now, granted, her show is more about spirituality and religion and all of that, so it makes sense. But think about those questions, the intention around your story and the message that you want to convey. I used to start my podcast with the question of, how did you get to the space of foreign policy and why are you here? And that question can be answered in many different ways. The second thing is listening and interviewing style, which I'm going to talk about very briefly toward the end. So podcasting is, in my opinion, about listening. The greatest podcast interviewers, or even if you think about interviewers overall, if you think about, to me, I think Oprah is a phenomenal interviewer. When I watch her, she asks really great questions because she listens. And I think, in our political space, where our brains are moving a million miles a minute, we're already anticipating what people are going to ask. We're already prepped for questions. We have our talking points. And I think that we could also benefit from just doing a little bit more listening to what people are saying, and then allowing that listening to inform what you ask next, right? And you can get very strategic with the questions that you come up with, which I'll talk about again in a second. Audience. This is tricky. Audience is there's a lot of science and information about how you can collect data in terms of who's listening to your podcast, where they're coming from, how they're listening, what platforms they're using. But audience engagement is really what it boils down to, is how are you keeping your listener interested? What things are you doing outside of the podcast and during your podcast episode to keep your listener engaged in what is happening on your episodes? There's a lot of ways people do this. If you're old school like me, you remember back in the day, you could call into the radio station and it was always exciting to hear your voice on the radio, right? People do that with podcasting as well, right? And maybe some of you, listen to podcasts and you hear I think it's Throughline, one of my favorite political podcasts. Throughline has its listeners, leave a voice note of the introduction of the podcast. So there are lots of creative ways that you can keep your audience engaged. I think the personality of the hosts and the guests make all the difference, as with lots of different things, right? If you're connected, if the listener feels connected to the speaker, it sort of makes it easier to want to listen some more, and they kind of build a relationship in their heads with that podcast host or with that guest. At least the really good podcasts do that. I would say that I'm assuming that most of you all will be like independent podcasters. For example, you're independent, meaning you're not connected to like an institution, say NPR, or maybe your local radio station, or a podcasting network. Those exist as well. I'm assuming you all, if you're interested in this platform, it's something that you would be doing on your own with your own resources. And so the beauty of that is that you have the creative flexibility, the artful, aesthetic flexibility to share your story in a way that's compelling, right? You don't have to worry about somebody else's mission impeding on yours. You are in control of the branding and the marketing. You are in control of advertising dollars if that's the route that you want to take. You're in control of the guests and what they say. So I wanted to just parenthetically say that independent podcasting is the frame that I'm looking at all of this work, and not necessarily a podcaster, say, who works for, a massive organization behind them. The science. So first, I want to share a resource with you all. If you are interested or you have staff who are interested in podcasting, there are lots of resources out there. The one that has been really helpful for me is PRX. They're based out of Boston. PRX Podcasting has amazing short videos that are maybe like, they're less than 10 minutes long, about the art and the science of podcasting. They also have a podcaster toolbox. And inside the toolbox, it's got information about everything from the tech side, how to edit, editing software, the difference between all the different platforms. So the toolbox is a great way to start if you're like, I don't even know what to do with this podcast idea that I have. So the science of podcasting. There's a lot of information out there, but I'll focus on the item about structure, audience, the platforms, and I'll also talk a little bit about social media. So the structure. These are the three types. There's the interview, a solo, and a conversation. So your interview format is you have one person interviewing, say, one or more individuals about a particular topic. It's very much like question and answer. There's a solo. If any of you listen to, say, for example, Amanda Seals, she literally just talks into the microphone. And I think that's it sounds easy, but to do a solo podcast, you need to be very engaging, very animated, and very interesting. And the stories, you have to be a phenomenal storyteller. Otherwise, it kind of just sounds like, church, where someone's behind a mic and just kind of talking at you. And so with solo podcasts, they are great. But it's more so for, I would say, for very animated personalities. Conversations are a hybrid of an interview and a solo. So a conversation is just that. Maybe you invite some people, you have some scripted questions, but you're also interjecting your thoughts, your opinions, other insights. You may have a part of the podcast that has you doing a solo where you're giving context to a particular situation or story. So I think for you all, where I think there's value is both the interview and the conversation, depending again on your goal for your podcast. Interviewing maybe a local business owner or interviewing a school teacher about education policy, right? Those I think are going to be the most relevant to you all. Your target audience, going back to what I said earlier, there is no science, I would say, to like figuring out who specifically is your target audience. The apps that are out there, the platforms that are out there, do give you statistics, but you want to make sure that at least the content that you're sharing is something that is easily digestible for your audience. I'll use my podcast, What in the World, as an example. Foreign policy can get really wonky. And I knew that I wanted to target a particular audience who was interested in foreign policy, but they weren't working at, CSIS or Brookings or any of the foreign policy think tanks, right? That was the foreign policy experts were not my target audience. My target audience were the barbershop folks, the folks at the nail salon, teachers, other educators, even the curious college student maybe who is taking classes but really wants a more historic perspective, a more diverse perspective on foreign policy. That was my target audience, and I had actually sat in a target audience class, which was really fun, and I got to develop, my avatar, basically an image of my target audience, and it was really great. So for you all, think about who you want to listen to your podcast. Who are you trying to reach? Now, the tension point is that who you want to reach may not necessarily be who listens to your podcast. This is like the quintessential challenge when you're an early podcaster just getting started. It's like, oftentimes the people who are attracted to your show aren't necessarily who you have in mind. And if I'm frank, I don't think that guys in the barbershop were listening to my podcast, even though I had intended the show to be for them. I probably needed to tailor my title and my guests and the content a little differently to attract them. But nonetheless, I think that if you feel like that's your issue, don't let that be the reason why you stop producing content. Still produce content, and you can play with different formats and structures and stories, so that you ultimately get your target audience or get access to your target audience. The platforms, I've listed them out here. There's plenty of them. As early podcasters, as independent podcasters, my suggestion is to not spend lots and lots of money. SoundCloud is free. Spotify is free. There are these podcast platforms like Podbean and Libsyn that are super duper cheap or sometimes free, for you to post your content up, and it pushes it out to various other platforms. Now, I don't know if budget will be an item for you all to consider, but podcasting pretty much can be done with your phone. There are apps out there that you can install on your phone. You speak into it, you hit send, and it shoots it out. It could be just as simple as that for free. And then there are other platforms and other ways of podcasting. When you think about editing, when you think about the various sounds that you want to bring in, right? You can get really expensive the more complicated or the more nuanced your podcast is. For a basic interview conversation, you can really honestly do it for free. But if you want good sound quality, you may want to invest a little bit of money into a sound editor. And you can get those dirt cheap. You can get a college student to do it, and pay them. I think every podcast should be edited in some way. I read, I'll talk about an author who I read who said that, not editing a podcast is like when you go to a dinner or to a restaurant and they serve you food, but you can still see the food from the previous guest on the plate. Or you look at a cup and you can see the lipstick mark, right, from the previous drinker. You don't want that, right? So you want to sanitize your stuff, clean your stuff up so that it's presented neatly for the audience. I'll just say one note about social media. There is a connection between social media presence and podcast listening. I've learned this the hard way. And I do think that the more that you are active on social media, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, wherever, even LinkedIn. LinkedIn was actually very helpful for me, surprisingly, because people actually in that space met they were more like the target audience for me. The more active you are in those spaces, the more, frankly, views you'll get for your content. So if you have someone in your office or someone in your network who's good at social media, you may want to talk with them about how you can leverage that to bring in a wider audience of listeners to your podcast. All right, so interviewing for success. Again, interviewing, there's so much to talk about with interviewing. This is an entire lecture. There are books written about interviewing. I've just compiled some that spoke to me. And I wanted to also share the resource that influenced much of what I'm about to say. There's a book called Making Noise, A Creator's Guide to Podcasting by Eric Nuzum. He spoke here in DC before we shut down at PRX, actually, a PRX garage over in Shaw here in Washington. And he talked about his book and some of the tips for interviewing. And it really made me rethink a lot of the way that even I engage with conversation with my friends and with my family. So with interviewing for podcasting, you want to remember that with podcasting, the goal isn't for you to look like the expert. The goal isn't to center necessarily you. Ideally, the goal would be you're centering the guest or another topic, right? So you want to do enough research, but you don't want to do so much research that you start asking questions that are not relevant or that the listener doesn't really care about. You want to leave a little bit of blanks with, your research, such that when you're having a conversation with someone, you're asking the question that the listener might want to ask. And that goes to my second point about curiosity. Podcasting is a game of curiosity, or is a test of curiosity. It's about you as the host coming up with the questions that listeners want to hear, may ask, are too afraid to ask, that maybe you yourself have always wondered, right? Sometimes the most obvious thing is the question that's like the most profound, and what keeps an audience, engaged. Remember that you are the proxy for the audience. You are an extension of the audience when it comes to podcasting. So get curious. Listen, listen, listen. Be yourself. With this space, with the political space, I believe that oftentimes we're trained to say certain things, to posture ourselves a particular way, and I think we absolutely should adhere to that. In podcasting, you have a little bit more room to be who you are, to be funny, to be quirky, to be a little bit more vulnerable about certain aspects of your life or the way you see a particular issue. And it goes without saying that, when you're interviewing other people, you want to have rapport, respect, and safety. I know that, and I don't think anybody here is this way, but I know that when we hear about certain platforms, like if you're watching Sean Hannity or any of these TV news programs, or even other podcasts and radio programs, it seems like there's a lot of yelling and banter and drama. And I know that gets clicks, that gets likes, that gets shared. I personally believe that great podcasting, even when there are disagreements, there's basic safety, respect, and rapport. Finished. Because you want people to absorb the information that's being shared. You don't want the listener to walk away feeling disgusted, right, or angry. You want them to feel like, I just learned something profound, and hopefully maybe they may change their behavior or thought on something. And to me, that only comes when there's a little bit of rapport, respect, and safety. Vulnerability, I'll say here, I found with my podcast, when I got feedback from friends who knew me, they were saying that I was not very open. And I think I focused too much on the guest early on. But I found that, there is value to sharing a little bit about you and your perspective, a little bit of your sort of ignorance about a particular topic. That can actually create great intimacy. And I think that's the thing about podcasting. It is an intimate sport. People have their headphones in, and maybe they're cleaning or they're driving or whatever. And they are, because they can't see you, they are listening to the sound of your voice. They are absorbing your content in a way that's different from say watching it on television. So you want to strike the balance between, putting somebody else and some other story on the center and also being vulnerable yourself. All right. Some quick lessons that I learned before we jump into a quick interactive activity. I know that you all know this, but I'm going to say it because it's true in podcasting. And that is, the story is in the editing. So I'm sure you all have seen interviews or heard stories where somebody's sentence was taken out of context or cut. Uh, and I want to caution that, the stories that we hear on NPR or on any podcast or any interview that we hear really has been edited more than likely to fit a particular narrative. And that is okay so long as it's done genuinely and it's not intended to be harmful. And when I was editing, I edited for my show, I edited for my church podcast, I edited for several other podcasts. And oftentimes, the host would be like, well, just put the interview out there. And what I would tell them is that, yeah, we could just put the story out there for people to raw edit. But I think that what editing, if you're careful, if you got a good editor, what they're able to do is weave together the pieces that make the most sense and leave out the fluff, leave out the stuff that's just not necessary, because people have limited time. Time. They have, short attention spans. So you want to be able to craft the interview, craft the story, and deliver something that will be palatable and meaningful for the listener. All right. So I'm going to jump to an interactive activity. I think we have plenty of time left. So I thought what we could do is practice some interviewing. And don't worry, it's going to be fun. So I wanted to see if we can get a couple of volunteers who might be interested in playing the role of interviewer to your podcast. And your episode is the impact of climate change on women. You know that Michelle fits your listener profile. Michelle, this is Michelle. This is a fake picture, by the way. This is really not Michelle. I just found this on the internet. But your listener profile is a woman who is 35 years old. She's a mother of small children. She works, she's partnered, and has at least at least a 2-year degree, and she lives in the suburbs of your community. Okay. So this is your listener profile. Your topic is impact of climate change on women. So what I want to do, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And what I want to do is ask you all, or ask anyone, what are the questions you might ask a guest on your show about the role of, or the impact of climate change on women. So Samantha, maybe I can get some help from you. If you are not comfortable speaking up and you want to type it in the chat box, please do. Otherwise, you can unmute yourself. Again, the question is, if you are the host of a podcast and the episode is the impact of climate change on women, your target audience is a 35-year-old woman who lives in the suburb and has kids and she's partnered, right? And she works. So what questions might you ask a guest expert on your show? And I'll pause to see if there are any questions and anybody wants to chime in.
Hi, Bunmi.
Hey, Maggie.
Yes, I volunteer as tribute.
Thank you for volunteering.
Yeah.
Our first podcast host. So you are the host. What would you ask of a guest?
I would probably ask, how do you see climate change impacts, everyday citizens? I think whenever you're thinking about people, especially busy women in general, that have children, and they sometimes it's hard to how these large policy issues affect, everyday people. So of course the first question would be, how do you see these wonky policy issues affect day-to-day people, and if they could give any examples.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I love that. Yeah, that's the thing with policy, is making it relevant, right? And yes, sometimes you just got to get straight to the question. So like, how do you see this impacting? And if I were the policy expert, I might be like, well, in the western suburbs of Chicago, we know that blah, 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 right? Okay, I love that. Any other questions you might ask of a guest if you were a podcast host? Keeping in mind your audience.
Yeah. Um, can I get it one more time? The framing of who the audience person is.
Yes, yes. I'm gonna try to share. Can I share my screen one more time? All right. So it is a woman. Here we go. She is 35 years of age, a mother of small children, working, partnered, has basically at least associate's degree, and lives in the suburbs.
Okay, so probably another thing I would ask the podcasters, a lot of times in the news, or I guess the interviewee, a lot of times in the news, we hear that climate change is a very
Mm,
expensive issue. And so, how do you think there are ways to pay for this policy
yes,
change in our community, and how will it affect citizens pockets as far as
yes.
taxes and just general everyday products.
I love it. If you want to get a listener clued in, you start talking about the money. That's what you do. You talk about the money. You nailed it, Maggie. That's exactly. There's like three things that like get people listening, like sex, money, and politics, right?
Mhm.
Like those things, if you put them all, or drama, I'll say politics, and really I'm talking about drama. Like, that's what gets people going. And so money, when you get to the money question, it makes it real for people because that's something that they can relate to. So I love, 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 love that question. You'd make a great politician or great podcaster. Great podcaster.
I well, I've heard I'd be both. So I Corey also put in the chat, the best ways that working women can help mitigate climate change in their own lives. So how working women can get climate change going in everyday situations, whether that's
Yes.
recycling. Yeah.
Yes. And Corey, what that's called is a call to action, right? So I think really great, particularly political podcasts, um, when they're great is when they have a call to action at the end. And this is a call to action question. Now, not picking on you, Corey, but I might like switch up the language because this is very political language, like mitigate climate change, right? We use the word, we overuse mitigate. I feel like, and like we know what that means. So, Corey, I might ask you like, how would you rephrase that question for Michelle so that she understands her call to action?
On it. She
Yeah, I'm
just
sure she's working
agreed.
on it. While she's working on it, thank you so much, Maggie. I really appreciate you coming up. It's so great to see you. Maggie's a Wrangle scholar, a Howard alum. She is doing amazing things. She's a superstar. So Maggie, thanks for coming up and supporting.
Yeah, I've already notified the masses that you are here today. Yeah.
Too fun, too fun. What other ways I want to make sure we have time for maybe a couple more people to share the podcasting stage and put their podcast, you know, hat on for a second. It's safe space. We can role play if you'd like, and I definitely want to open it up to questions before we end. Who would like to take a stab at this exercise?
I'm happy
Samantha?
to jump on.
Yes, please.
What's the question again? Sorry, the prompt.
So the question is, you are the scenario is you are the host of a podcast, and your episode is about the impact of climate change on women.
Okay.
And you know that your listenership is women over the age of 35. They are partnered, they are educated, and they're working. So, what are the questions you might ask of a guest on your show?
Oh, over 35 women, climate change. I might like kind of go towards like motherhood in a way about,
Okay.
what is the world going to look like for the future
Mhm.
generation and how can we either prevent that or build that? Something around along those lines.
I love so future forward looking,
Yes.
right? The forward looking questions and interviews, right? Are you can get really creative with those questions. And the way you might frame it is exactly how you said it. Or you can say, in 20 years, what does the next generation have to deal with when it comes? What does the next generation of women have to deal with if we don't address the issue of climate change?
Yes.
Right? What are women, and that as a listener, I'm like, oh crap, in 20 years my kid's going to be 20 years old, or my kid's going to be 25, right? So that forces the listener to like stop what they're doing and really like go there with you, right? Go with that conversation of imagining the future, right? Podcasting is very much about using the voice and stories to help the listener like think, imagine in their brain, kind of like reading a book, right? About the issue. I love that, Samantha. What's another one?
Let's see.
I'm Michelle. I'm Michelle. I'm your listener. I'm listening to your podcast. I've got my kid in tow. I'm on my way to work. I'm texting my husband at the same time, and I live within 10 miles of a landfill.
Oh gosh. Yeah. Well then, I'd probably ask a question about, how the environment is going to affect our health, I guess.
Mm,
Yeah. Maybe
yes.
go on long-term health impacts of living
Yes.
near toxic substances.
Yes. Yes. Health impacts as a mom, right? Women are always, most women, many women, parents, right, are concerned about the healthy environment, right? And so, yeah, that's a perfect question. The health impacts, especially on women when we think about, breast cancer, and we think about all the sort of the cancer challenges, right? That are cancer issues that women deal with. So, absolutely, absolutely. Let's see. Corey asked, women, especially working moms, are so busy. Are there simple ways that they can be involved in fighting climate change that fits in their everyday lives? That's perfect. That's perfect. The call to action is, you're a busy woman. What you gonna do about this here landfill? What can they do? What can they do about, and it may not even be a landfill. Maybe it's something about recycling, right? What can you do? I love that. I love the rephrasing. Andrea says, if we're focusing on motherhood, what would make them feel more supported about empowering and involving their kids? How are they having these conversations at dinner? Yes, 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 yes. What I like about Andrea's question is, this is where you can incorporate audience feedback, right? So you could pose this question before the show starts, maybe on your website, your social media, have them send in a recording and say, hey, um, tell us how you manage, climate change in your household. How are you having this conversation with your family? What has your family done to address climate change? And have people just share their stories, right? And then you, Samantha, as the host, play those stories, give your reaction, or maybe have your expert, give their reaction to things that women are saying about climate, how they're addressing climate change directly in their household. That's a great question, Andrea. I love it. I love it. Samantha, what else, if any, would you ask?
Probably would talk like things like misconceptions around, uh,
Mm.
you know, environmentalism. Like you mentioned recycling, and so much of recycling just goes back into landfills. So maybe ask about, what are some things we do that would seem helpful but could be more harmful than we think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I think that any opportunity a podcast host has to um, do some fact checking is great. And if you've done a little bit of research, You might be able to find some of those misconceptions yourself, or even think about your own personal. This is where the vulnerability part comes in, right? You could be like, you know what? I actually dump all my stuff in one trash bin and I don't even know what's happening. Does it get separated? Does it not get separated? Right? That's a misconception that I learned, right? It's like, oh, well, I dump everything in one trash bin. Is it true that somebody comes around to actually separate it? Like, right? So, dispelling myths, dealing with misconceptions. That's a great way to, again, shape the narrative, to center the conversation, and to really, like, I think with political work, really like reshape the way we dialogue around these issues, because so much is out there that's like not true. So as podcasters, you have the opportunity to use this platform to set the record straight, right? Even if you only have 2 listeners, if those 2 listeners share your podcast because they heard something really phenomenal and interesting, if they share it to more people and 2 more people listen and 2 more people listen, and you have 10 listeners for the month, I still think that's a win. You don't need, 25,000 listeners to be impactful. I really think it's about the message. So thank you, Samantha. Awesome, awesome. Let's see. Andrea also says, let's see, Corey, I'm going to scroll up. I remember a politician bringing in a snowball on the White House floor to show that climate change isn't real. This seems like a type of gaslighting. Could you talk about how some in power are dismissing the lived realities of those affected by climate change and how that could affect their mental health? Yes. Woo. Corey, I'm assuming you're saying that this is something you would raise as a podcaster. Phenomenal example of a way to dispel an issue with your guest, right? You could play a clip of this incident on the House floor, and have your guest respond to the clip. You could do it yourself if you're doing like a solo podcast type thing. But yes, I think that, any way you can bring in outside dissenting commentary, assuming it's not like repulsive and super offensive, any way you can bring in other voices is another way to keep people hooked. And again, that was something that I learned later on as I started podcasting, as I grew in my own editing skills. I was like, oh, so this is how you find sound. This is this clip. I listened to news differently. I would hear something and be like, I'm going to jot that down, go onto YouTube, find the clip and pull it into my next podcast, right? As a way to sort of keep the conversation spicy. So yes, Corey, I love that question. All right, Andrea says, to stay focused and motivated, how are they measuring progress in communities on climate change? Great question, Andrea. Again, the same way I said to Corey, how might you reframe that question for Michelle, who may not necessarily care about metrics and measurements and charts and graphs? Michelle, is again carrying her kid on her way to work. Husband's texting her, she's maybe got a PTA meeting later on. How might you get to the point about impact, which is, I think, what you're trying to ask with that question? I'll give you a second to marinate and rephrase it, but I like where you're going with that one. While Andrea is doing that, I want to open it up for questions. I'm here to answer anything about myself, about my podcast, about podcasting in general, things I didn't talk about, or maybe I put something up on the slide and you want me to sort of revisit something, but happy to answer any questions, either in the chat or you can pop up on the screen.
Yeah, I have some questions in the Q&A. I'm going to ask, what kind of resources would you recommend to track your podcast engagement? Are there analytics tools to keep track of new subscribers, general listeners, etc.?
Yes, absolutely. So typically with every podcast platform, they provide data for you. So if you register your podcast or sign up to say Podbean, Libsyn, there's so many out there. And they all vary, frankly, in price and in complexity. I would say I use Anchor. So I'll type it in the chat box here. anchor.fm because it's free. Anchor easily allows you to upload and edit your shows, and they do give you basic podcast statistics. Now, if you want more complicated, in-depth information about your listeners, then you would typically need to pay for something like a Libsyn. I'm going to type it here, Libsyn. There's Podbean. There's God. Those are the two. Those are the two that I've used frequently. But there's so many out there that'll give you more detail on your episode listenership, how long people are listening to your show, at what point they're cutting off, their geographic, what kind of phone they're using, if they're using an Android versus an Apple phone. So yeah, you can definitely get that from your podcast platform that you're using. Let's see. Oh, before
And then we have another question. How do you deal with copyright laws for pulling audio visual clips?
Ooh, now this is an area where I will honestly say that I shied away from intentionally because it was very complicated. But the bottom line is, don't take anything that belongs to somebody else without their permission. Point blank, period. Whether it's music. Now, when it comes to things like, like there are sites where they have a composite of like news clips or sound bites, right? Maybe it's like the sound of an audience clapping. Those spaces, they'll tell you like, you can take this content and use it. I will say, I know this is a conference and we all follow the rules here. In the beginning, was taking things from like CNN's website and just like uploading it onto my podcast, or I'd edit it out once I got fancy with editing. And I was told like, I'm fine because I'm like independent. No one, like, I'm not on NPR. But if you want to cover your bases, you should probably like get permission first from, these major spaces. And you'll be surprised, people are actually like very open and cool with like you using their content, because in a way it gives them publicity. So that's that. With music, it's another ball game completely. With music, I had music on my podcast and I actually had to like chill on that because certain platforms don't play music that you don't have the permission to play. Like they've figured out how to, detect that with your podcast. So with music, if it's a local artist or an artist, like if you're going to use Beyonce, I mean, you can test the waters if you want to. I don't think Beyonce will care, but if you wanted to, use Beyonce stuff, like you should be careful. I'm not a lawyer here, so you might want to talk to like, there's plenty of resources online about sound and copyright. If you're, for example, using a local artist or there's someone local in your community who is a little bit more accessible, shooting them an email or tweeting at them or DMing them, is also fine to say, hey, like, I heard this clip, I just want to use it on my podcast. Is that okay? And usually people are pretty fine with it. So I'm sorry, that's not a straightforward answer, but I would say definitely look into some of the copyright laws around podcasting online. There's lots of resources out there.
Great. And we have another question. How are you able to balance creating your podcast episodes with your career? What kind of challenges came up?
Great question. When I first started the podcast, I was unemployed. And it was easy. I would wake up, I'd go down to the Arlington Independent Media over in Arlington. I'd show up at the booth. I'd do my recording. I'd do my editing. I worked on other people's podcasts. I had time. Sure enough, when I started working, that became a little harder. The first job I had after the Obama administration, fortunately, we were kind of like in telework mode, so I could work out of a WeWork or work at home. I didn't have to like be at certain spaces, so it was easier then. But as I grew as a podcaster and as I wanted to change the way I delivered the story, I knew it would take more time. So I wanted to move from the interview format to more of a storytelling, right? Where you're bringing in different sounds. Maybe you have multiple guests. You have other clips from the news, right? I'm doing more solo narration, right? That takes a lot of time and resources that I did not have. I progressed in my paid job, right? Which meant that I had less time to look for sponsors, to find a really good editor, to work on social media. I'm also, while I like social media, I'm not in love with it. So I really, for the last season, I hired a social media coordinator. She was great. But even managing somebody took time. So the challenges that came up were one, my own like standard, like I'm a perfectionist and I had to let some of that go with the podcasting. Otherwise, I would sit on episodes for months and months and months, trying to get the perfect thing. And part of my issue was that I was like listening to amazing podcasts. I was listening to Throughline. I was listening to Horrible Decisions. I was listening to amazing podcasts, right? And I was like, "Ooh, I want my podcast to sound like that," right? It was totally unrealistic by myself. So knowing that I could stop where I was at and it would be good enough was a challenge. Eventually, I got over it and it was fine. Another challenge I didn't expect was, like the foreign policy space is small. And my podcast kind of made the circles. Like it made the circles, and I started getting hit up left and right to appear on other podcasts, to talk about podcasting, to give my opinion on things. And I still had a full time day job. I did not imagine that anybody would care what I had to say, frankly. I was just doing it because I liked it. I had the time. And I kind of got addicted to like just talking to people. I did not want to do this to get famous. That was not my intention. Not that I became like famous, but like it opened up a lot of opportunity that like I think was beyond my capacity to deal with. Good opportunities. Rakia knows this. I worked with Rakia in the past with Truman. And so especially last year with 2020 and everything that happened, like I burned out quickly with the podcasting, and it became unenjoyable after a certain while. So that was also the reason why I took a pause. It was like, okay, I'm going to come back, recenter, and maybe flip it and try something different. Still related to foreign policy, but I wanted to come back refreshed and feeling like I had the tools. My lesson learned for women here, I think most of us are women, like, don't be afraid to ask for help. You'll be surprised who's willing to help you. And I think that's something I didn't do enough, was I didn't reach out enough to people and ask for help. And the next go around, whatever I decide to do, I will definitely be hitting up some people at Rakia. So yes. What other questions can I answer?
I think it's 10:20, so we are out of time. But I guess we can wrap up with this last question from Andrea. What kind of prep work do you do before bringing a guest on? And then if you want to do some closing remarks after.
Yeah. Prep work. So definitely do research on the topic. So a lot of times with the foreign policy space, foreign policy topics, I knew enough, but I didn't know a lot. Oh, I didn't know I didn't have like a conceptual framework. So I would do like a little bit of research about the topic. That also helped frame who I wanted to ask. So with my podcast, I specifically only wanted women and people of color as guests, period. So I did a lot of prep work by researching who was out there talking about space, who was talking about nukes, who was talking about China. and trade, right? So I was doing research on that. And I also was looking at what other podcasts had talked about because I wanted to be different. I didn't want to be repeating what necessarily NPR or Crooked Media or any other podcast was talking about. So I would like do some quick searches and I would listen to essentially my competitors and hear how they talked about it. And I was like, oh, I can talk about this. Like they didn't ask this, they didn't ask that. They missed this perspective, they missed that perspective, right? So that's how I sort of would frame how my show would be offering something different, right? Also, my target audience was a little different than Crooked Media and NPR because I ain't rich. Also, I had like an episode planning sheet. So in my episode planning sheet, I had the goal of my episode, all the logistical information for my guest, and then I had a little mini script with what I wanted to say to contextualize my questions. I had the questions, and I had resources. And this all worked to be the template for me sharing that with my listeners. So later on in my podcast, I started actually sharing my resources on my website. So if you go to my website, underneath the episodes, you'll see the resources or things you should know. And that came directly from my own research. So that's how I did. I did a lot of like early on, just like deep breathing because I get so nervous. I did a lot of praying before I would start because again, I'd get nervous. But after a while, it was fine. I would prep with my guests. Absolutely prep with your guests because I learned also like you just never know what people are going to say. People get really different when they get behind the microphone. So you want to, talk with your guests maybe just for like 10, 15 minutes beforehand if you can. Just to like warm them up a little bit. So I'll stop there and happy to answer, questions separately about prep. It definitely is something you should do. My closing remarks are get out there, share your voice, be loud, be proud, be fun, be interesting, be yourself, and ask the questions. No question is dumb when it comes.
I'm not sure if it's just frozen on my screen or not, but thank you, Bunmi, for the great presentation, answering all of our questions. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today and joining us for our conference this whole month.